a regime that lost millions in battle, yet convinced generations it had never truly been defeated. What happens when propaganda becomes more powerful than truth, when even catastrophe is rewritten as triumph? This is the story of how the Soviet Union turned its darkest defeats into eternal glory. Before the outbreak of the German-Soviet War, Soviet propaganda stood as one of the central instruments of state power. Since the early 1930s, it had been cultivated by the centralized organs of agitation and press, led by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda of the Communist Party. The Soviet population had already been conditioned to perceive all state actions as infallible and all criticism as betrayal. Newspapers such as Pravda, Izvestia, and Krasnaya Zvezda presented the Red Army as an invincible modern force, equipped with advanced technology, superior ideology, and unshakable morale. The political commissar system ensured ideological compliance within every unit, tying military discipline to party loyalty. By June 1941, the USSR maintained one of the largest propaganda infrastructures in history. Over 8,000 newspapers, 15,000 radio transmitters, and thousands of mobile cinemas and wall posters distributed across the Union. Official slogans declared that any aggressor will be crushed on his own territory. Yet the actual state of the Red Army remained far from this ideal. Intelligence on Germany's buildup was inconsistent. Command structures were weakened by Stalin's purges of 1937-1939, during which roughly 35,000 officers were dismissed or arrested, and the Army's morale was built more on fear than on conviction. When Operation Barbarossa began on 22 June 1941, the entire Soviet propaganda apparatus faced an existential crisis. The rapid collapse of the Western fronts, losses of more than 3 million soldiers in the first 6 months, and the encirclement of entire armies contradicted years of triumphalist messaging. The gap between ideology and battlefield reality was enormous. Yet the state could not publicly admit military failure. Instead, it sought a new narrative framework that could absorb disaster while preserving legitimacy. The first step was silence. In the first week of the invasion, the Soviet press barely reported the scale of the German advance. Official bulletins described temporary retreats or tactical regroupings. Stalin's radio address of 3 July 1941, his first since the war began, acknowledged difficulties but reframed them as proof of the Soviet people's heroic endurance. The rhetorical emphasis shifted from inevitable victory to defense of the motherland. By redefining the war as the Great Patriotic War, propaganda turned the defeat of the Red Army into a moral trial of the entire nation. Posters depicted peasant women raising rifles, workers transforming factories into arsenals, and soldiers standing amid ruins with slogans like "Everything for the front" and "Not a step back." The failure to stop the Wehrmacht was recast as a collective baptism of fire. What had begun as a political crisis turned into a mobilization campaign rooted in emotional sacrifice rather than strategic success. Soviet propaganda thus evolved from the glorification of strength into the glorification of suffering, the ideological foundation for transforming defeat into glory. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht's army groups north, center, and south advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. Entire fronts collapsed under coordinated German armored thrusts and Luftwaffe air superiority. By the end of July, Minsk, Smolensk, and most of Ukraine's western regions were lost. According to Soviet General Staff data, over 20,000 tanks and 15,000 aircraft had been destroyed or captured by September. The Red Army's defensive lines disintegrated, and more than 3 million soldiers fell prisoner during the first phase of the campaign. Facing a scale of defeat unprecedented in modern warfare, Soviet propaganda was forced to perform an immediate transformation. The early slogans of "crush the fascist aggressor on his own soil" were abandoned. New language emphasized heroism, endurance, and the moral superiority of the Soviet system. The concept of temporary difficulty. Official communiques avoided naming lost cities or encircled armies. Instead, they stressed fierce resistance and delaying actions. The focus shifted from strategic success to individual sacrifice, portraying isolated acts of defense as national triumphs. In July 1941, the central newspaper Pravda began publishing short reports on heroes of the front, featuring soldiers who destroyed enemy tanks with grenades or fought to the last bullet. These stories, often based on fragmentary or invented accounts, were designed to fill the void left by massive battlefield losses. Soviet writers such as Ilya Ehrenberg and Konstantin Simonov were mobilized to create emotional narratives that emphasized defiance rather than accuracy. The propagandists understood that the population needed meaning in chaos. Defeat could be endured only if presented as part of a larger moral victory. By autumn, the Central Committee ordered the creation of a new framework for mass communication, a blend of military reporting, patriotic myth-making, and carefully selected optimism. The Soviet Information Bureau became the main instrument for this policy. Its bulletins, read daily on radio and reprinted in the press, standardized how information about the war was presented. Each communique followed a strict pattern: acknowledgement of German attacks, emphasis on Soviet resistance, and mention of local counterblows, regardless of outcome. The goal was consistency, to assure citizens that control had never been lost. At the same time, a network of field correspondents and military journalists was deployed to record heroic episodes. Their task was not to describe. No photograph, article, or letter could be released without political clearance. Casualty numbers were never disclosed, and the term retreat virtually disappeared from the press. Even the word encirclement was replaced by fighting in difficult conditions. This manipulation of language was deliberate. Propaganda aimed to reshape the public's understanding of loss itself. To lose ground was to endure was to resist, and resistance meant victory in moral terms. The visual dimension of propaganda played an equally central role. Artists such as Irakli Toidze and Viktor Koretsky designed posters that became icons of the war. One image, showing a woman in red holding the oath of a soldier beneath the slogan, "The Motherland Calls," appeared on millions of walls and barracks. The use of color, gesture, and symbolism followed precise ideological rules: red for sacrifice, steel gray for determination, black for fascism. The effect was to merge the emotional and the political, transforming the abstract idea of the state into a personal cause. Film studios evacuated to the Volga region, and Central Asia continued to produce documentaries like Moscow Strikes Back, 1942, which combined genuine footage of winter battles with staged sequences. The narration, approved by Stalin himself, declared that the enemy met his fate in the snowdrifts of Russian land. Western audiences saw it as evidence of Soviet courage, but domestically, the film served a different purpose. It reframed the near collapse of 1941 as proof of destiny and resilience. What could not be denied was simply rewritten as a prelude to triumph. Behind this transformation stood a political calculation. Propaganda did not exist solely to inspire. It functioned to maintain control. The same posters that glorified collective heroism also soldiers who faltered risked being branded as traitors, while success stories were exaggerated to set impossible standards. By the end of 1942, political departments had distributed over 10 million leaflets to frontline troops, combining orders with moral instruction. "Remember the motherland, remember Stalingrad," read one, even before the battle there began. The construction of myth preceded the events themselves. This shift from reporting to storytelling marked the full emergence of red propaganda as a weapon equal to artillery or armor. It created a psychological front where every loss was immediately absorbed into the narrative of eventual redemption. When German offensives resumed toward the Volga and the Caucasus, the Soviet population already possessed a vocabulary for interpreting disaster. Propaganda had succeeded in transforming defeat In the summer of 1942, the German Wehrmacht launched Case Blue, a massive offensive aimed at seizing the Caucasus oil fields and cutting the Volga lifeline. Within weeks, Soviet defenses collapsed again in Ukraine and southern Russia. The fall of Rostov-on-Don and the retreat across the Don River exposed the weakness of Soviet command and coordination. Yet, instead of acknowledging these defeats, the propaganda apparatus intensified its portrayal of strategic withdrawal as a deliberate, heroic maneuver. Every step backward was reframed as preparation for a larger trap. The language of the press grew ritualized. Our forces withdrew to more advantageous positions, became a formula repeated in every bulletin. The advance of German troops toward Stalingrad placed the Soviet state in another existential position. The propaganda narrative had to transform not only loss, but the expectation of annihilation into a symbol of faith. By August, the Luftwaffe had turned Stalingrad into ruins, and over 40,000 civilians had been killed within days. Still, the Soviet press insisted that the city stands unbroken. Inside the ruins, reporters and artists embedded with the troops sent back selective, often stylized accounts of street battles. Writers such as Vasily Grossman crafted frontline reports that emphasized the individuality of heroism while erasing the desperation of the situation. Soldiers fighting in cellars and factories were depicted as embodiments of the iron will of socialism. The state's communication strategy reached unprecedented levels of control. From mid-1942, all information about operations, losses, and unit movements was centralized in Moscow. Radio transmissions from the front were prohibited unless approved by the Supreme Command. When the German Sixth Army reached the Volga in September, the narrative turned apocalyptic. The fate of the entire war was said to depend on the defense of a single city. This narrative, carefully orchestrated, created a moral siege parallel to the physical one. To surrender Stalingrad would mean betraying the revolution itself. Posters and pamphlets began to merge military and religious imagery. "For the motherland," for Stalin, replaced earlier slogans, turning political obedience into sacred duty. The face of Stalin appeared on medals, newspapers, and banners, personifying the endurance of the nation. The cult of personality reached the front lines. Units received telegrams from the Supreme Commander congratulating them on imagined victories or encouraging them to stand like granite. Fear and faith became indistinguishable tools of cohesion. Propaganda was no longer simply persuasive. At the same time, the Soviet leadership recognized the need for international legitimacy. Foreign journalists were invited to witness fragments of the battle. Carefully curated footage of Soviet resilience was distributed to Allied media, contrasting with Nazi claims of imminent victory. Films such as The Defense of Stalingrad and reports by Western correspondents shaped the image of the USSR as the bulwark of civilization against fascism. For domestic audiences, however, the focus remained absolute sacrifice. Soviet newspapers omitted all mention of the city's near destruction or the immense civilian casualties. Instead, they glorified sniper duels, tank crews fighting in isolation, and women operating machine guns amid the ruins. By late 1942, the narrative of turning defeat into glory reached full maturity. The propaganda did not deny suffering. It sanctified it. The loss of entire armies became proof of moral. The defense of Stalingrad was presented as the culmination of Soviet destiny, where death itself was redefined as participation in victory. This transformation prepared the population for the psychological leap that would follow. The moment when, after 18 months of disaster, the Red Army would begin to win. When the German Sixth Army was encircled in November, the event was immediately mythologized before the battle had even concluded. Bulletins declared the beginning of the enemy's end, though the fighting would continue for months. The Soviet press now referred to the turning tide and the dawn of retribution. What had begun as a desperate act of defense became the centerpiece of a new historical narrative. The defeat of 1941-42 was rewritten as a necessary trial, proving that the Soviet system could transform destruction into rebirth. The same propaganda machine that once concealed catastrophe now claimed ownership of victory, forging the ideological weapon that would dominate post-war memory, the triumph born from ruin. By February 1943, the Soviet victory at Stalingrad provided the regime with its most potent symbolic asset. For the first time since the beginning of the war, propaganda did not need to invent victory. It could magnify it. The annihilation of the German Sixth Army became the foundation of an immense ideological construction that fused military triumph with moral rebirth. Yet, the real battle behind the front was for interpretation. The transformation of a costly, near-catastrophic struggle into proof of the infallibility of the Soviet system. Within days of the German surrender, newspapers across the USSR printed headlines in enormous red letters: Stalingrad, the grave of fascism. Radio broadcasts repeated the word victory hundreds of times per hour, while editors received instructions to frame the event as a triumph of socialist organization and Stalin's strategic genius. The figure of Stalin was elevated to near mythical status. Official bulletins credited him personally with the encirclement plan known as Operation Uranus. Maps published in Pravda replaced tactical details with sweeping arrows of red, visually implying inevitability. The human cost, over 1 million Soviet casualties, was absent from all coverage. The propaganda machine sought to redefine the meaning of war itself. Stalingrad was portrayed not as a battle among thousands, but as writers and filmmakers introduced the term Holy War of Liberation. Soviet poets such as Konstantin Simonov and Alexander Tvardovsky created verses that merged personal grief with collective pride. Their works appeared on the front pages of army newspapers and were read aloud in factories, schools, and hospitals. This emotional saturation reinforced the belief that suffering had been purposeful, a necessary sacrifice for humanity's salvation. Internationally, the Soviet government understood the propaganda value of the victory. The documentary Stalingrad 1943 was translated into English and French, distributed to Allied audiences through diplomatic channels. Foreign journalists were given controlled access to the ruins, guided by NKVD officers who ensured that no footage revealed the scale of destruction or civilian suffering. The city was presented as a monument of endurance, not devastation. For the domestic audience, the narrative followed a stricter line. Stalingrad was the proof that communism produced invincible warriors. From that point forward, the image of the Red Army would always be tied to moral superiority rather than military efficiency. Simultaneously, propaganda expanded beyond the battlefield. The Soviet Information Bureau instructed local committees to organize meetings of gratitude across the Union. In factories, workers signed pledges to exceed production norms in honor of Stalingrad. Women's committees were urged to write letters to the front expressing maternal pride and moral duty. The entire society became part of a collective performance of triumph, designed to erase the trauma of earlier defeats. The regime discovered that victory, once mythologized, could be as unifying as fear. However, the same machinery that glorified victory also concealed the fragile state of the country. In the first half of 1943, Soviet losses in other sectors remained severe, and logistical crises persisted. Propaganda compensated by inflating every success. When Kursk became the next major confrontation, Soviet bulletins described German preparations as the final convulsion of a dying beast. The narrative no longer admitted uncertainty or vulnerability. A self-perpetuating illusion emerged. Victory was inevitable because it had already been proven at Stalingrad. This belief shaped strategic communication, military morale, and public psychology alike. By mid-1943, the fusion of military reporting and ideological messaging reached its peak. Newspapers no longer distinguished between truth and symbolism. They functioned as instruments of faith. Each issue of Red Star and Izvestia carried portraits of soldiers labeled Heroes of the Motherland, many of whom had died months earlier. The Soviet Union was now fighting not only a war of survival, but a war for his. The propaganda that once masked defeat had become the foundation of identity, transforming the entire wartime experience into a continuous ascent toward redemption. The summer of 1943 marked a decisive evolution in the Soviet propaganda system. The victory at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, allowed Moscow to assert that the Red Army had regained full strategic initiative. In reality, the cost of victory was immense, approximately 250,000 Soviet casualties and over 1,600 tanks destroyed, but none of this appeared in print. Newspapers and radio celebrated the battle as proof of Soviet technological and moral superiority. The official story described the German offensive as crushed by the collective genius of Stalin, and the indomitable censorship intensified accordingly. After Kursk, the State Defense Committee issued directives forbidding the publication of any material that could diminish faith in the Red Army's absolute advantage. Even weather reports were adjusted to prevent information leaks to the enemy. The distinction between information and ideology disappeared. Every newspaper, poster, and newsreel was now an instrument of command. Stalin personally reviewed the text of key communiques, often changing a single phrase to amplify the tone of inevitability. He understood that control over interpretation was more powerful than control over facts. Simultaneously, the regime expanded its propaganda to occupied and liberated territories. As Soviet forces advanced westward through Ukraine and Belarus, special agitation brigades followed behind the army. Their task was to re-establish party authority and spread the image of the returning state as both avenger and liberator. Loudspeaker trucks played patriotic songs, while mobile cinemas screened films showing German atrocities. Villages that had suffered under occupation were encouraged to hold public ceremonies of denunciation. Testimonies of survivors were recorded, edited, and published as official narratives of fascist crimes. In this process, the suffering of civilians was transformed into moral ammunition, evidence of why Soviet power must never again be challenged. The Church, previously persecuted by the regime, was cautiously reintegrated into the propaganda framework. In September 1943, the Moscow Patriarchate was re-established under state supervision. This move provided a new emotional dimension. Orthodoxy was redefined as a patriotic force. Sermons began to mirror the tone of military bulletins, blessing weapons and soldiers in the name of victory. Religious imagery, long suppressed, was selectively restored to strengthen unity. The concept of a holy war for the motherland merged political loyalty with spiritual legitimacy. Stalin's portrait often appeared alongside icons of saints in improvised chapels on the front, symbolizing the fusion of divine destiny and party leadership. Cinema and literature carried this transformation further. The war film Two Soldiers, 1943, presented the archetype of the cheerful, unbreakable Soviet fighter. Stage performances and radio plays glorified the virtues of discipline, friendship, and devotion to Stalin. The formula of narrative victory was replicated endlessly. An ordinary man or woman endured hardship, sacrificed self-interest, and triumphed through collective strength. The effect was to erase the complexity of experience. Propaganda offered citizens not reality, but a script of survival, one that demanded faith rather than understanding. At the same time, the myth of unity began to conceal internal fracture. Reports of desertion, looting, and collaboration were suppressed. Political departments in the Red Army compiled secret memoranda noting exhaustion, resentment, and disbelief among the troops. None of these documents were ever made public. Official rhetoric continued to insist that every Soviet soldier fights with joy and awareness of his historic duty. The gap between propaganda and lived experience widened, but there was no alternative source of truth. By the end of 1943, Soviet propaganda had achieved its primary goal: to stabilize the national psyche through controlled optimism. The population, though exhausted and grieving, believed in the inevitability of victory. The myth of infallibility now extended beyond the battlefield. It enveloped every aspect of life. To question the narrative was to risk one's freedom or life. Yet it was this same myth that sustained the country through the final 2 years of the war. Through repetition and ritual, the Soviet Union had perfected its most enduring weapon: the ability to turn suffering into conviction and conviction into victory. By 1944, Soviet propaganda entered its most triumphant phase. The Red Army's counteroffensives, Operation Bagration in Belarus, the liberation of Ukraine, and the advance toward the Baltic and Balkans provided a flood of real victories that could be woven into the myth of historic retribution. For the first time since 1941, the Soviet press reported large-scale successes with genuine accuracy, though even now the details were shaped by ideology. Casualties were omitted, strategic errors ignored, and the contribution of Allied forces understated. The message was simple: the Red Army, guided by Stalin, had saved humanity. The narrative of collective redemption replaced that of collective suffering. The summer campaign of 1940, Operation Bagration, destroyed Germany's Army Group Center, inflicting nearly 400,000 Axis casualties. Soviet newspapers presented it as the final judgment upon fascism. Each liberated city was described as reborn under the Red Banner, each river crossing as an act of vengeance for Stalingrad. Propaganda leaflets proclaimed that the Red Army is bringing light to Europe, merging military conquest with moral mission. Even logistical events, such as the reopening of railway lines or the restoration of food supply, were reported as ideological triumphs, proof that socialism rebuilt faster than fascism could destroy. The tone of propaganda also evolved. Where once it had relied on appeals to endurance and sacrifice, it now emphasized destiny and superiority. Films such as The Battle for Russia and The Fall of Berlin, filmed partly before the war ended, presented the Soviet soldier as both liberator and avenger. Newsreels juxtaposed the ruins of occupied cities with images of advancing tanks and cheering civilians. The juxtaposition created a dual image: the Soviet Union as a victim redeemed through righteous power. In this reimagined moral order, the destruction wrought by total war became a necessary purification of the world. Within the USSR, propaganda extended deep into private life. Schools resumed lessons under new curricula that included wartime morality as central doctrine. Children memorized stories of young partisans and pioneers who sacrificed themselves for the motherland. The press began to publish serialized biographies of people's heroes, most of them stylized composites rather than individuals. Music, poetry, and art were synchronized with the official tone. Symphonies celebrated victory, posters portrayed farmers and soldiers raising flags together, and slogans declared "Glory to the people who cannot be defeated." The war became less a series of events than a single continuous legend of unity. This ideological expansion, however, came with deliberate omissions. The crimes of Soviet forces during the advance, mass deportations, executions of suspected collaborators, and plunder were entirely absent from the press. Reports from Poland and the Baltic states were rewritten to depict Soviet entry as liberation, even when it led to new repression. Local communist movements were presented as spontaneous expressions of gratitude rather than instruments of Moscow's policy. The propaganda of 1944-45 thus performed a dual function. It glorified victory abroad while concealing coercion at home. The image of moral purity remained essential to justify the coming reorganization of post-war Europe under Soviet influence. At the front, the political departments maintained the same system of ideological reinforcement. Every regiment carried field newspapers that mixed battle news with propaganda essays. Political officers read aloud speeches attributed to Stalin before major offensives, assuring soldiers that the hour of final revenge had come. Soldiers wrote letters quoting official slogans, sometimes unaware they were reproducing phrases from state pamphlets. The line between genuine conviction and institutional indoctrination vanished. The belief in destiny had become self-sustaining. The population no longer needed proof of victory, only confirmation that it was deserved. By early 1945, Soviet propaganda had achieved total saturation. No aspect of public or private life existed outside its framework. The concept of truth itself had been redefined. To be patriotic was to accept the narrative as fact. The myth of transformation, from defeat to glory, had completed its arc. The same institutions that once hid the collapse of 1941 now proclaimed the dawn of a new world order. The propaganda that began as a shield for survival had become the ideological foundation of empire, preparing the Soviet people for victory celebrations that would extend far beyond the battlefield. When Berlin fell in May 1945, Soviet propaganda reached its zenith. The capture of the German capital and the hoisting of the Red Banner over the Reichstag symbolized not only military victory, but the ultimate realization of a carefully built narrative. The war that had begun with humiliation and near collapse was now presented as an unbroken march of righteousness. The official story omitted the chaos of the final battles, the staggering losses of more than 26 million Soviet citizens, and the devastation of vast territories. Instead, the victory was framed as the natural outcome of ideological purity, industrial strength, and the wisdom of Stalin's leadership. Immediately after the fall of Berlin, the Central Committee ordered a full reorientation of propaganda. The focus shifted from wartime mobilization to post-war glorification. The phrase Great Patriotic War became institutionalized. It redefined the entire conflict as a self-contained saga of moral triumph, distinct from the broader Second World War. This linguistic shift was deliberate. It placed Soviet victory above that of the Allies, elevating the USSR from participant to savior of civilization. Newspapers filled with superlatives, and films were commissioned to immortalize the moment. The 1949 production The Fall of Berlin depicted Stalin as a messianic figure, orchestrating victory from afar. Facts yielded to myth, and myth became official history. Inside the country, the tone of propaganda changed from desperation to ritual. Victory Day celebrations were introduced as annual displays of loyalty. Mass parades, war trophies, and speeches were choreographed to remind citizens of their collective duty to preserve unity. At the same time, the regime sought to erase memories of 1941's disasters. The defeat of the early war years was described as a temporary difficulty overcome by the genius of leadership and the unbreakable will of the people. Veterans who had been prisoners of war or served in penal units were excluded from official narratives. The Red Army was portrayed as an unblemished instrument of liberation. This reconstruction of memory extended beyond. The statues depicted soldiers standing upright, never defeated, often holding a child or a flag instead of a weapon. These visual choices were not accidental. They embodied the transformation of pain into moral legitimacy. The act of remembrance itself became a political ritual. To mourn was to praise. To question was to betray. Through these symbols, propaganda ensured that even grief served state ideology. Abroad, the Soviet Union launched a campaign to shape the international understanding of the war. Diplomatic publications, exhibitions, and cultural delegations presented the USSR as the decisive force in the defeat of fascism. Western aid through Lend-Lease was minimized, while Soviet contributions were magnified beyond proportion. The Red Army was portrayed as both liberator and builder, reconstructing Europe from ashes. In Eastern Europe, newly established communist regimes adopted this narrative wholesale. School textbooks in Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia repeated the same sequence of ideas. The Soviet Union had led the world from darkness to light. Propaganda thus extended into geopolitics, justifying Soviet dominance as the reward for its heroic mission. Internally, Stalin's regime tightened its ideological control. Censorship boards continued to purge literature, films, and academic works that deviated from the official version of the war. Military historians were ordered to revise campaign reports, replacing operational failures with accounts of strategic foresight. The 1948 publication of The History of the Great Patriotic War became the canonical narrative, blending selective truth with political messaging. Stalin himself was credited as supreme strategist, moral guide, and father of victory. The state succeeded in converting propaganda from a wartime. By the late 1940s, this mythology had fully penetrated Soviet consciousness. Children learned of the war not as a struggle for survival, but as a preordained triumph of socialism. Films, songs, and school lessons depicted the past as unambiguous righteousness. The collective trauma of invasion, famine, and repression was replaced with a single, redemptive narrative. The USSR had risen from ruin to glory. The mechanism that once masked defeat now defined identity. Propaganda had not merely rewritten history, it had created a new moral universe where victory erased all contradiction, and truth itself served the purpose of the state. In the early post-war years, Soviet propaganda transformed from an instrument of wartime mobilization into a permanent system of historical management. Between 1946 and 1953, its central purpose was to consolidate Stalin's authority by fixing the image of the Great Patriotic War. The government sought to turn the population's collective memory into a unified ideology, ensuring that every recollection of suffering or doubt was replaced by gratitude and pride. The mechanisms of wartime propaganda, control of information, manipulation of symbols, glorification of leadership, were now institutionalized across education, culture, and science. The first major task was rewriting history. In 1946, a directive of the Central Committee ordered the preparation of official wartime chronicles. Military correspondents and historians who had documented actual events were instructed to revise their work according to new ideological standards. Command mistakes, political executions, and retreats were omitted. The defeats of 1941 and 1942 were reframed as strategic withdrawals, while Stalingrad and Kursk were described as the inevitable results of Stalin's foresight. The Soviet people's role remained central. Textbooks emphasized that, under the guidance of the great leader, the people revealed unprecedented strength. Facts became parables, and parables became doctrine. Cultural propaganda reinforced these themes. Literature and cinema of the late 1940s were dominated by triumphalist narratives. The 1949 film The Fall of Berlin depicted Stalin as an omnipresent, benevolent figure, orchestrating victory through calm wisdom. Soldiers and citizens in the film addressed him with reverence, their faces lit as if by divine light. Poets such as Nikolai Tikhonov and Mikhail Isakovsky published verses equating Stalin's name with victory itself. The press adopted formulaic language, repeating phrases like "the immortal deeds of the Soviet people" and "the genius of Stalin, architect of victory." Repetition replaced persuasion. Propaganda functioned through ritual rather than argument. At the same time, the regime used the language of victory to suppress dissent. Veterans who questioned the official narrative were accused of slander against the Soviet people. Those who had been prisoners of war were often branded as traitors upon return, excluded from the image of collective heroism. Civilian survivors of occupation zones faced suspicion rather than honor. Propaganda portrayed the post-war society as unified and harmonious, but beneath this facade lay deep wounds. The reality of hunger, homelessness, and political terror was incompatible with the official story. Instead of addressing these conditions, state media flooded the population with triumphalist imagery, banners, parades, and monuments reaffirming the moral rightness of the Soviet path. The cult of Stalin reached its highest intensity during these years. Every factory, school, and military unit displayed portraits of him surrounded by slogans about victory. Speeches credited him personally with every achievement, from the rebuilding of cities to the discovery of new oil fields. Even scientific accomplishments were linked to his wisdom. The transformation of defeat into glory had found its final expression. History itself was remade to demonstrate that suffering, obedience, and loyalty were the natural laws of progress. Stalin's voice on radio broadcasts was presented as the continuation of the wartime command, a reminder that vigilance must never cease. Outside the Soviet Union, the same propaganda shaped the emerging Eastern Bloc. Newly established communist governments in Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest adopted the Soviet victory myth as the ideological cornerstone of their regimes. In these countries, the Red Army was portrayed exclusively as a liberating force, erasing the complexities of occupation. Soviet advisors supervised museums, school programs, and commemorative events. The message was consistent. The USSR had not only won the war, but had redeemed humanity itself. This narrative justified Soviet dominance and silenced competing memories of suffering, repression, or collaboration. By the early 1950s, the transformation of defeat into glory was complete. The Soviet people no longer possessed an unfiltered memory of 1941 or 1942. These years existed only as prefaces to triumph. Propaganda had achieved what no military campaign could: the re-engineering of collective consciousness. The war had become both the foundation and the justification of the post-war order. In the Soviet Union of Stalin's final years, history itself was disciplined like an army, obedient, uniform, and ready to serve the next command. The myth of victory had replaced truth, and in that myth, the myth of victory that had defined his rule could not be dismantled without undermining the very legitimacy of the state. Yet the new leadership under Malenkov and later Khrushchev recognized that the cult of personality surrounding Stalin had become politically dangerous. The task, therefore, was to preserve the grandeur of the Great Patriotic War while erasing its association with a single man. This delicate operation produced a new form of propaganda, one that replaced fear with reverence and reinterpreted glory as a collective achievement of the Soviet people rather than the triumph of a leader. The first adjustments appeared in 1955, when official publications began to emphasize the heroism of the masses. The term Stalin's victory quietly disappeared from press articles, replaced by the people's victory. At the same time, censorship continued to suppress alternative interpretations. The official history of the war was republished with only minor corrections. Strategic failures remained untold, and the catastrophic losses of 1941 were still described as a period of testing. The purpose of this narrative was no longer to mobilize or to terrify, but to sanctify. The war had become sacred history, the moral foundation of Soviet patriotism. It was no longer about facts, but about belonging. Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956 marked a limited rupture. While denouncing Stalin's abuses, it carefully avoided questioning the myth of the Great Patriotic War. Indeed, the leadership intensified the commemoration of victory to fill the ideological void left by Stalin's fall. New films such as The Cranes Are Flying and Ballad of a Soldier presented the war through human suffering rather than divine leadership, yet they remained within the same moral framework: sacrifice leading to redemption. The focus shifted from obedience to compassion, but the underlying message endured. The Soviet Union's suffering had given it the right to moral authority over the world. The transformation of defeat into glory persisted, only with a softer tone. During the 1960s and 1970s, this myth became a civic religion. The Brezhnev era institutionalized victory as the unassailable center of Soviet identity. Veterans were finally honored publicly. New monuments and museums appeared in every major city. Propaganda materials presented the war as the ultimate proof of the superiority of the socialist system. School programs, literature, and cinema repeated the same structure: invasion, sacrifice, victory, gratitude. Every May 9th, the Victory Day Parade reaffirmed that unity, discipline, and suffering were permanent virtues. The complexity of wartime experience, famine, forced labor, executions, collaboration, remained hidden. What mattered was the image of harmony, the illusion of a people who had always known their destiny. This process shaped not only memory, but morality. The idea that truth was secondary to purpose, that suffering could be justified by results, became embedded in Soviet consciousness. Propaganda no longer needed to deceive actively. Its greatest success was that citizens repeated its narrative sincerely. Even historians who sought accuracy worked within invisible limits, unable to question the fundamental myth of redemption. The war had become a mirror reflecting what the Soviet Union wished to be: heroic, disciplined, and eternally victorious. By the 1980s, the myth of the Great Patriotic War remained the most stable element of Soviet ideology, even as the rest of the system began to erode. Only during Glasnost did previously suppressed archives reveal the scale of loss and repression, yet the emotional power of the narrative endured. Generations had been raised to see glory where there had been ruin, to find pride in suffering, and to view obedience as patriotism. The propaganda that began in 1941 as a shield against despair had outlived the regime that created it. In the end, turning defeat into glory was not merely a wartime strategy. It became the core mechanism of Soviet identity. It taught millions to interpret pain as victory and to measure truth by its usefulness to the state. The Red propaganda achieved what armies could not. It conquered memory itself. Through decades of repetition, it built a nation that saw history not as what had happened, but as what must be believed. The Soviet Union would eventually collapse, but its mythology of triumph born from disaster would survive, echoing in monuments, parades, and speeches long after the red flag ceased to fly.